Hello everybody, my name is Aubrey and I'm an opera singer and a voice coach. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Northwest's most recent performance in The Lion King. I know that a lot of YouTubers are discussing this topic, but for the sake of education, I kind of just want to focus on what happened in the show and more about the techniques involved in singing, which can be very useful for a lot of learners. So if you happen to be one of those singers in the audience who could really relate to Northwest's performance, this might be the video for you, because today we're going to just spend some time talking about what happened and how we could change that the next time we get ourselves on stage. So with that being said, let's take a peek over at Northwest in The Lion King. So let's pause right there for a second, because I think there's some stuff that I'd like to talk about. So first off, let me point out she's really young, and in the vocal community, we all kind of are aware of the fact that the voice needs time to mature. So let's make a mental note of that before we really dive into this, just so you guys are aware. As she starts off, she's a little bit heavy. There's a lot of like a talky element to it, and that's not uncommon. A lot of us feel very comfortable in our talking range because it just happens to be where we spend most of our day. So when it comes to phonation, right, I would argue most of us are talking, laughing, coughing, things like that. And that tends to be a pretty narrow window when it comes to pitch. This talkiness ultimately ends up making it feel a little bit March-like because that rigidity doesn't feel very natural. One of my favorite things that I bring up is not letting the words become too choppy. When we're trying to explain ourselves through song, it's very easy for us to feel pressured to make everything very clear. And that is great. We want to have good diction for sure. However, if that comes at the cost of fluidity and musicality, we need to start thinking about things a different way. I like to think about the phrase as a string. The phrase is also made up of the breath. So the breath being the thing that connects all the little beads together, beads being the words. That ultimately can be put together in a big piece like a necklace, and that is akin to a song. So when I'm imagining myself going through any piece, I think about the breath being that string connecting all the little pieces together so that I can make an ultimately beautiful final product. So when it comes to this piece, she would definitely benefit from helping the words goo together a little bit more, letting it flow one word into the next. Even though that can feel a little bit scary to give up the reins, it ends up actually coming across quite natural. My example of this every single time is when I talk like this. It's kind of hard for you to understand what I'm saying. The brain works really well when we're talking all connected. When we separate it, it actually makes it a little bit hard for our brain to predict what's happening next. And then as a result, we end up spending a little bit of brain power putting all those words together so we can get that sentence. That ends up happening too in our music occasionally. So what I would recommend her try to do is think more about how those words are connecting into a sentence and find the end point of where she's trying to go in the phrase and use that as a guide for herself to create a bit more of a bigger picture versus each individual word at a specific time. The next thing that I think a lot of people noticed very quickly is that the pitch feels a bit pressed. And with that pressure comes slight variation, which is kind of tricky. Is it related to the live performance being something stressful? Very possibly. I think that one thing that people forget about, or perhaps they don't know if they haven't been on stage yet, is when you get on stage, gosh, you really don't know what your body is going to do until you get there. And I am no different than this. When I get on stage, I have the worst knee knocking. It is just absolutely bonkers. I have never really figured out why. It's just what my body subconsciously does. So the more times I've been on stage, the more times I've had to practice mitigating that anxiety response. And I wear clothes that kind of hide it. I try to do deep breathing before I go on. I try to also be aware of the fact that that's gonna happen to me and it can't bother me. I have to kind of just ignore it. After a while, it eventually goes away and I enjoy the performance much more. But for those first few minutes, I definitely feel a little bit anxious. I have plenty of colleagues, students, everybody around me who has their own little things that happen when they get up on stage that doesn't occur when they're in lessons or singing in the car. So if you haven't spent much time on stage yet, it might be a surprise what your body ends up doing. And then when you go to try and manage it, you might not have the tools to do it yet. So I want to take that into consideration in this performance, just in case she hasn't spent too much time in front of a crowd this big and with that level of pressure. Also, that goes for you as well. If you haven't been on stage yet, be prepared. You might have some stuff happen that is kind of out of your control. But my best piece of advice for that is try not to panic. Try to breathe through it and relax through it. Try your best to just kind of acknowledge that it's occurring and it's just part of who you are as a performer, and to try and let that go. It's easier to say that than to do it, I know, but give that a shot if you ever find yourself on stage and you haven't got a lot of stage experience yet. The other piece of advice is probably advice that everybody's heard at some point, is you get better by just doing it. And in this case, it's absolutely true. You kind of just have to get a couple of performances under your belt so you learn about your body. Until then, it's going to be a little bit tricky for you to manage. Another thing that she can do to help her pitch is to play a little bit with the vowels. Anybody who has watched me on this channel knows that I love vowels. Vowels are one of the best things that we can modify in order to change pitch, change color, change all sorts of stuff. And in this case, I find her going into spaces that are very wide. They're very horizontal. E. These colors are really wide and they don't have a lot of warmth to them. So sometimes when we're going into those spaces, they feel pressed because we want to make it happen, right? In reality, we actually want to create a space that's a little bit more neutral, a little warmer, a little rounder, so that the voice doesn't feel compelled to work. As singers, we're trying to do the least amount of work possible. So when you find yourself being tricked into using a very horizontal vowel shape, remember my favorite vowel, the schwa. It sounds like It's just a neutral sound. I like to mix it with any vowel I can whenever I'm having trouble to just add a little bit of that extra warmth, that extra roundness. So instead of way, it becomes way. And that, you can already hear the resonance change. It's not a lot of work, but it can make a big difference. She could also benefit from letting go of some of that really, really bright diction on words like main event. I could really hear main event. I could really hear those separations of the vowels, and it kind of squeezes at the end of it. So just to prevent that, I like to think about all my vowels being very similar to one another. And I do this exercise regularly just to remind myself where everything is. And it's just e, o, u. And the goal is to try and see how similar I can make my mouth feel between each one of those vowels. It's not the most fancy exercise, but it works, and it allows people to kind of isolate where they might have a vowel that's sticking out a bit and maybe just soften it up so you have less transition from one vowel to the next. In addition to the choppiness, I think that also goes hand in hand with a wee bit of tension she's holding in her body. I know as she's moving throughout the stage, she seems a little bit stiff. And like I said before, if you're in front of your teacher, if you're in the car, if you're at dress rehearsal, sometimes these things just don't occur. And so it doesn't happen until you're in the midst of the actual performance. And when we're in those spaces where we start finding ourselves getting very stiff, we have to let our brain relax a little bit. I like to focus more on the words. I like to think more about the emotions that the song is trying to elicit from me, instead of thinking about, what do I look like? What do I look like? What do I look like? Those kinds of things really interrupt my musical flow, and it ends up translating to the voice as well. So you get this double hit, right? Not only am I remembering the blocking for the stage motions, but I'm also in trouble because I'm getting tense and nervous and I want all the diction to be correct. So all these things together end up with a pretty rigid and choppy color. The trick really is trying your best to relax and trying to let the music guide you instead of you trying to guide the music. I would have really liked to see her do a little bit more variation on the roar, but it's kind of a strange thing to do, this like non-pitched element. Sometimes people feel a little bit uncomfortable doing that, especially when we're younger. I found myself struggling to like whisper in choirs when I had to do that. It felt funny and it took me a while to get comfortable doing non-pitched elements. And when she doesn't add that little extra spice to the performance, I think the audience can feel that because there is an expectation based on what we've already seen with the original Disney. This is another element that's coming into play too. I can kind of hear her thinking about the original rendition of the song, which is not abnormal. I find a lot of people come to me wondering how they can separate themselves from the original song. How do you do an effective cover? To do an effective cover, I think about it like a spectrum. On one end, you've got the nostalgia, which is going to give the audience that fuzzy feeling of recognition. And then the other end is your unique voice, your artistry. And I like to try and go somewhere in the middle. Obviously, I like to lean maybe more towards the personal artistry, but at least far enough away from the nostalgia so that I don't feel like I'm copying the original and so that other people in the audience aren't directly comparing me to that original. So when we have these repeating patterns, like when she's singing, no one's saying, etc., etc., these spots can be really difficult for us because we need to figure out new reasons as to why we're repeating these different phrases over and over again. Why are we saying these different things in this similar format? Each one should elicit a different response. As a result, allow you to give a different performance for each one, making them independently valuable. Otherwise, it kind of just ends up sounding like it's a repeating phrase that gets mushy. I can't really tell the difference between one versus another. Personally, I'm a visualizer, so I write out a lot of my thoughts and feelings on the music when I've got it, and I would recommend her maybe doing the same thing. If you're interested in trying that out, I like using color-coded highlighters. Basically, I give each highlighter an emotion, and then I highlight what I want to do to give myself a very, very rough overview of what I want to accomplish. The color coding helps me to think less, while still giving me a bit of structure so that I don't feel totally lost. Let's continue.
Well, I think it's time that you and I arranged a heart-to-heart.
She's no needed place from little boy Bill's first start.
Look, if this is where the monarchy is headed, count me out of service, out of that sitcom. I wouldn't hang about. This child is getting wildly out of wing.
Oh, I just can't wait to be Everybody looks left, everybody moves right, everybody looks right, standing in the spotlight.
Yeah.
Every people can see. Let's sing it in the word of the ring. It's gonna be Jesus Christ's name. Oh, I just can't wait to be king. Oh, I just can't wait to be king. Oh, I just can't wait to be king.
Alright, there we go. So let's talk about the ending. I see people go up on stage quite often and underestimate the effect of motion on their breathing because breathing is very sensitive. Even a little bit of motion can cause us to feel a little bit of that breathlessness coming in. So when we're doing this, we have to be very, very careful. And if we have to do a lot of blocking, take that into consideration before you sing. It's very hard for us to find our breath after we start losing it. When she's singing, everybody look left, everybody look right, that can be a little bit choppy. When we're doing a list, we want to still think about the next phrase in our sequence. That way it feels like it's going from one to the next. Kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with the words being allowed to flow into one another. We still want the breath, even when we're not singing, to feel directioned. When we breathe, it is technically a period of resting, right? Even if it's not necessarily written into the music and we just need to take that breath should still feel like it's in the shape of where we're going next. And that allows us to feel that continuity from one chunk of the voice to the next. Unfortunately, she's entering the dreaded passaggio. The ending really shows some of that increased pressure and some of those pitch variations as a result. When we're in the passaggio, it is very much a delicate game of balance. We want that breath to feel like it's supporting and it's confident and full, but if it's too much, we crack. But if it's too little, we end up sounding airy. One of the best ways for me to show that to some of my students is doing a siren, which is just starting from the very bottom of your range and going to the very top and then right back down again. I feel like this is a classic, many people do it, but it's super effective and it shows you exactly where that instability from the passaggio starts coming in. I find that I have one going up and one going down. Sometimes I even have another one if I find myself going into the super, super low, but the main one that a lot of people are very fearful of is that one that's transitioning from your middle voice up to your high voice. When we are in that tiny spot, you really want to see if you can feel where you place the shapes of the vowels, as well as how much breath you need. I find that it's very common for people to continue maintaining the same breath pressure that they have in their lower voice as they have in their high voice. But if you do not drop some of that air pressure, it's just going to end up being very, very hard for you to sing comfortably in the passaggio without it sounding like yelling. In my experience, my middle voice just doesn't feel like my high voice, and that's not a bad thing. They actually should feel a little different. You're going to use a different breath pressure and you're going to use different vowel shapes to show off the best colors that you have in each of these sections, and that is cool. We really don't want to sacrifice our beautiful color for things like volume. I find that a lot of people fall victim to the sensation of the surrounding environment being loud and them wanting to be louder than that environment, which sometimes is just not possible for a vocalist. We do have a very strict volume limitation. And so if we start trying to push over that because it's so loud around us, we're going to end up in a position where we're using too much air, we might crack, we might hurt ourselves. And so we don't want to end up doing that. One of the ways that I work through a section of a piece that is in my passaggio is to take a hum and hum through those notes. A hum causes an extra point of contact, which does not allow as much air to go through. So it's really hard to push too much air into a hum. So I find that it's a really safe way for me to practice getting these notes comfortable and kind of like finding a position somewhere in my mechanism that works. And then when I open my mouth, I can better orient myself and feel more comfortable with a healthier volume. We ultimately really don't want to hurt ourselves for obvious reasons. So whenever we're singing a song, regardless of what the genre is, really try to be guided by comfort. If your voice starts itching or hurting or feeling strained, you might want to take a break and see if perhaps a slight adjustment here or there might alleviate that discomfort. I know that sounds kind of obvious to say out loud, but in reality, it can be very tempting for us to ignore those warning signs. It's okay to modify things. In the end, if you're not going to Carnegie Hall next week, you probably have some time to figure out something that works for you. All in all, I hope that this was an educational video for you. I really tried to focus on things that I heard in her performance that maybe you as a listener heard and went, ooh, I kind of do that too. And some ways that we can work through that together. Regardless of who we are, it's extremely difficult to get up on stage. And it can be even more difficult when there's a lot of discussions that are not very constructive about our technique. Even if it feels scary, even if you don't feel confident yet, in order to get better, you have to give it a shot. I don't care if you haven't sung in 20 years or if you've never sung at all. If you have any interest in doing it, you should go out and try. It's a great opportunity for you to learn a little bit about yourself, and you already have your instrument installed into you. So anytime you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the comments section. I'll always try my best to answer them, and I hope that you had as much fun as I did. I love talking about different components of the voice and different things that we can do to make ourselves feel more confident. I look forward to the next video, and I'll see you again soon. Remember, keep on singing.